It's certainly a hot topic here in Ontario this fall. This is part 2 of What's the Minimum here on Flying for Flavor. So I'm hoping that you've digested your Thanksgiving dinner by now. It has been a week since Thanksgiving, but I know how much I ate last weekend. So of course I am just starting to feel normal again. So welcome to What's the Minimum Part 2. This episode is basically going to continue on the same topic from the What's the Minimum Part 1 earlier in September. And it's going to focus on more of the general business side of the pending minimum wage hikes here in Ontario. So the last time I interviewed Bev Wills, restaurant manager here in Sudbury, and this time we're going to be focusing on interviews with 2 other people from 2 different other industries, just to give you an overview or a better idea of other people in business and what they're thinking about these pending changes and how it can affect you, whether you're working in the service industry or you're actually just someone who's dining out. Can't remember if I mentioned it during the last or the first part of this What's the Minimum episode, but I did interview my Sudbury Secret servers about this minimum wage increase that's pending with all the other changes. And surprisingly, they didn't have an idea at all about what was coming, changes were happening, how it could affect them. They were so relying on their tips as their main part of their income that it made sense that they weren't quite aware. So I was happy to sort of inform them about it, but there wasn't really anything that they were sharing that day for me to share with you on this podcast episode. So for this time, that's the reason that we're focusing more on the managers and business owner side of the story. And whenever possible, I will speak for the other side of the people who are earning minimum wage, whether it is alcohol service or otherwise. So I thank everyone, again, for allowing me to play around with the sound quality for these podcasts. I'm still testing out different settings. My software is so big and powerful that it seems that it never seems to record the same way twice. And I'm also working on redoing my little studio here. So I'll be working on it over this weekend while you're listening to this. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to get rid of more of the echo and just make it a little bit more cozy so that when I have some special guests once in a while, it'll make everyone relax and enjoy the process. So in the meantime, here is your first part of the interview. This is a chat that I had actually, it was like late spring, early summer when I first started planning this podcast that I managed to arrange for quite a good sit down with a friend of mine. Her name is Tracy Nutt. She is the past board chair of our Sudbury Chamber of Commerce. She is also the owner of Build North Construction and Service Master here in Sudbury. Service Master provides cleaning services and stuff for local businesses. So she does have a good range of different staff that she pays at different wage levels, including minimum wage or close to it. So she has a really good understanding of how these pending changes are going to affect her employees on both the Build North and the Service Master side, as well as talking to other business owners as her capacity through the Chamber of Commerce here in Sudbury. So I thought we'd do a little bit of a background, and I'm going to start this interview with Tracy telling her story of how she tried to present her case to the Ministry of Labour as they were touring Ontario earlier this year, and what she really wanted to tell them.
So after the bill passed first reading, it was sent immediately to the Standing Committee for Finance and Economic Affairs, I think it's called. And they were holding, I believe, 15 town hall meetings. You applied to be heard if you wished to make an oral presentation before the committee. And if you didn't want to do that or weren't able to do that, you could submit a written summation to the committee. So I applied for the opportunity to make an oral presentation, and I was declined. too many applicants, just too many people.
Oh, so that was the only reason they gave
yes,
you? Okay.
Yes. So I applied to go to the committee meeting in North Bay, was the closest one. So Thunder Bay, North Bay, and then they kind of wander through the rest of the province. They're still ongoing, I understand. Anyway, I was declined. They didn't have enough space on the agenda for the amount of applicants. So I decided to submit a written, which I did on Friday. And I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, because when I first wrote it, I was extremely angry. As I was typing, I could just feel the flush of the blood pressure going up, because it is going to impact my business in so many ways. It's not. Well, it is calculable, because I did the math, and that was part of my written submission. Was here's on my payroll of my one company alone. So I have a janitorial building services company, janitorial. Fully 85% of my costs are wages. Very, very little is spent in the way of chemicals or equipment or supplies by comparison to the labor costs. It's virtually all labor. So I took my payroll for that one company, and I crunched the numbers. I broke it down to the number of annual hours paid to janitorial. I took the staff out, I took owner salaries out, and I just came up with the production hours. Bottom line, after I add in the new minimum wage, the 6% vacation after 5 years, because I do have a number of employees that have that, and the 2 paid sick days for 100 employees, my payroll costs alone will go up 39%. That's including labor burden, EI, CPP, all of EHT, WSIB. It's all based on payroll dollars. So it compounds. It's not enough to say that we're going to increase minimum wage. We're increasing EI and CPP, health tax, WSIB, benefits if there's any of that in there. That'll also increase what we pay out on for statutory holidays, because of course that's based on averaging of hours as well. So it's a huge increase to my operating costs, and a huge chunk off of the bottom line. To be exact, it exceeds what we will see as an increase in 2018 if these changes do go through. It exceeds my net profit of last year considerably.
I think that's probably one of the reasons that I don't think that a lot of people, maybe the people who are making minimum wage currently, do you think that a lot of them maybe don't have the exact numbers, or their managers or supervisors or business owners are telling them that, there's much more to the costs of labor besides that, but maybe they don't see the numbers?
I'm quite sure employees don't know what the burden costs are. I really don't. I think some of them probably don't even realize that for every dollar of CPP they have deducted, we submit the same amount on their behalf, or EI, we submit 1.4% of what's deducted off their check. I think most employees don't know that there's a contribution that goes towards them from the employer as well.
Well, I think that even though they get the pay stubs, they may not be noticing it, because a lot of times it's broken down right on there, what all the deductions were, what extra was paid on their behalf.
They don't see what's submitted on their behalf. They only see what's deducted from their own paycheck. It would be nice if there was a payroll software that showed, this is how much we deducted and this is how much the company submitted, as well as on your behalf. But to my knowledge, there isn't a payroll company that
No, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of online calculators, so that even somebody who's trying to calculate what their paycheck is going to be, as opposed to just showing them what the actual net amount is, actually shows them the entire breakdown. There's always these online calculators.
Yeah.
If there's something like that out, I can do some research. Be the nerd that I am, I'll go and look it up.
Yeah, I don't know if there is or not. It would be interesting to know if any of the employees really cared.
Yeah, and then that's one of the reasons that I want to do this, is that because there is such a large chunk of the population that's going to be affected by this, not just business owners, even people who aren't currently making minimum wage, they're going to still be affected by price increases, right? And it may or may not even affect their own current wages. We don't know, depending on what their industry they're in or how they're being paid. So it's going to be an interesting thing. things, but I guess we're at a point now that it's basically going to be mandated. The changes are coming, right?
Something's coming.
Something
Absolutely.
is coming. Okay, so if you can't stop the train, what do you think the next step is for a business owner? Like, is it going to be basically reevaluating the entire employee section of things? It is an automatic price increase. Like, what is your priority of how you can sort of maybe get through the first 6 months of it without creating a huge upheaval on this end?
Well, I own a franchise, and so when the announcement came down from the Ministry of Labor about the proposed changes, we had an emergency conference call. And a number of the suggestions that were made, there were a number of suggestions made. Some of them were, we can just, send to all of our clients a letter across the board, 25% increase or 29% or whatever we felt was going to cover off on the increase. The increases that we were going to be having to absorb. Others came up with suggestions that if our clients simply can't bear a 25% increase in their services, will some of them let us go and do it in-house, or will they reduce the number of service days, or will they reduce the scope of work? If there's a reduction in service days or scope of work, there's a reduction in hours. So
it all filters down eventually.
It filters down one way, or it's either going to filter up to higher rates in the service industry, or it's going to filter down to reduction in hours. So at the end of the day, yes, the employee will be making a higher rate of pay. However, if they're working less hours, it's one of those one step forward, 1.5 or 2 steps back. We have to be able to retain our customer base, or we have what's the purpose in being in business and what's the purpose in having employees. So we've got to figure out where that sweet spot is between increasing our rates and reducing the service. And I think there'll be a bit of both depending on the client. Also in our industry, we may be by some clients even deemed as unnecessary. Look, we'll figure out a way to clean our own toilets or vacuum our own rugs.
I was going to say good luck to you. I guess it's one of those. It's one of those services that sometimes gets overlooked, but is usually a necessity, right?
Well, and in my written submission, I suggested that if at some point maybe you arrive to work and find that your garbage hasn't been cleaned or there's no toilet paper in the dispenser in the bathroom, you'll know why.
It's the little things, right?
It's the little things. Another huge factor for me is the personal emergency leave days. Never mind that I'm paying 2 days of sick time. I understand that and I can accept that. But the other 8 days where an employee can just simply choose not to come to work, if they're on a schedule already, you're scrambling in the morning to find somebody to cover that shift. The burden is going to be borne by their co-workers if they work in a team environment. Everybody will be doing, 5 people will be doing the work of 6, or 3 people will be doing the work of 4. It's going to be a nightmare certainly in my industry to be able to cover off, and in my case, 1,000 days a year. I have to be prepared to fill 1,000 shifts, potentially.
Yes.
For 100 employees, 10 days off in an entire year. And sure, there'll be people that won't take any of those days because 8 of the 10 are not paid, but there will be employees that take all of them. So I have to prepare for that.
So is there, because as much as I've read about the new changes that are coming through, we talk about the personal emergency days. Is there an exact definition of what qualifies an emergency? Is that part of the problem? Is that if somebody just claims that this is a personal emergency for me, they have the right to take that time off? That's
my understanding. Now, I don't know whether there's going to be rules surrounding notice time to the employer. I know that you can't ask for an explanation. Suffice it to say the employee is taking a day off. I don't know whether there will be rules around whether they can take the Monday after or the Tuesday after a long weekend or the Friday before a long weekend.
I've also seen evidence of that occasionally in my previous businesses. But yes, they seem to, or seems to be like the after-hour shifts or the longer shifts are the first ones that they don't want on weekends. But I mean, it also depends on the worker, and I think that's basically going to hopefully kind of draw a line in the sand of which workers are going to step up to the plate and which ones are going to kind of look at every kind of loophole. I mean, they're already there, I'm sure, but I guess I'm kind of nervous about how that's going to affect, because I know that there's that 48-hour window now that's coming into effect where if you need to change a shift or cancel it, so the employer now has to give 48 hours notice, but the employee themselves can call in that morning and say, I'm not coming in.
Or not call in at all.
You don't have to call in. There's no notice required. There's no statements on it yet.
Well, there's no statements on it yet. But I mean, that's the what we call it, no call, no show. It happens. It happens certainly in my industry. And eventually you get a hold of the employee and, whatever, the excuse might be. But the dilemma here in Sudbury is, and all of northeastern Ontario, I believe, we all have the same problem. There's a chronic shortage of workers. And it's a tough industry to staff, and so you tend to have to kind of look the other way often when that occurs. Okay, well, I'd like you to understand the importance of notifying us so that we can cover that shift. But you're right. So they, speaking about the shift change notification, how do you marry those two new changes to legislation? Everybody's entitled to 10 days off. And yet everybody's entitled to 48 hours notice to change their shift. I have to tell you, Stephanie, pretty much every day of the year around here, my schedule, and we call them rolling schedules. So they're 2 weeks at a time. Every Monday, this week drops off and another week is added on, and we just keep rolling ahead.
So everyone knows their schedule well in advance.
Everyone knows their schedule well in advance. 2 weeks.
That's beyond that 48 hours.
Yes. However, today, for instance, people called in sick. So right out of the gate, I've got shifts to fill, and I can't give anybody 48 hours notice.
Yeah, so when you think about that, so how is that going to fill? So if someone does call in sick, the employee can take the shift because you have to give 48 hours notice.
They can take it.
They can still take it, but they have every right to refuse it, and you can't penalize them for it. That's the issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've covered a couple of topics so far, mostly about how the personal leave days are going to affect scheduling, and then we talked a little bit about the minimum wage hike and how much of an increase the business owners are going to be absorbing in a very short period of time. And when I say short time, of course, if you haven't read up on this or not, the big bump is coming up January 1st, 2018. So I thought I would give a little bit of a personal updates just so you know that it's not one particular business or the other. So when I had my catering business, one of the factors that I decided to sort of step back from it for about a year or so ago now had to do a lot with food prices. The bulk of my costs, of course, were the cost of the foods that I was using to prepare the dishes that I would serve my guests and my clients. The other major part of my business, of course, was labor. So my staff was critical in delivering the service level that I was requiring and my clients were expecting. So I didn't pay the standard minimum wage. I did pay a little bit more, just like Tracy does. And then depending on how long they were there, I always made sure there was tips, add a little extra in, made sure that they're fed, because that's what I do is feed people. But I also think back now about how these changes would have affected my pricing for my clients. And one of the things I know here in Northern Ontario is that it's a little bit more price sensitive for special occasion catering. So I kind of specialized in higher end hors d'oeuvres, corporate events, sometimes office lunches, but for the most part, I was starting to do really large events, weddings, that kind of thing, where when you're feeding 100 more people, your price per person is something that really needs to be negotiated. And so I was putting in bids for citywide events, that kind of thing. And the food costs alone were almost pricing me out of things because I used ingredients that were a little higher end. I'd source things differently. I made things from scratch. So I was absorbing a lot of the labor by doing things personally myself to save on the labor costs. And with the minimum wage hike, I mean, I can't serve 100 people on my own. I just don't know. Because I would feel obligated to also give the increase to the staff that I was hiring. Because one thing in the catering industry, unless you have enough volume of business to be able to have staff on full time all the time, I relied heavily on my casual labor. And most of my service team were restaurant servers and bartenders who would basically come and work for me and pick up shifts after hours. So they're used to working at a different wage with tips. But I also was appreciative of the fact that they were already trained and knew the industry. So they were easily able to step in and kind of walk in when they needed to, where I don't know if other industries would have that same flexibility with casual staff. So, I mean, I had it good. I had a great staff, a great team, but I don't know if I could have afforded to pay that much of an increase in that short of period of time with the recent food price hikes and still be able to be competitive with pricing for what my clients here in Sudbury were looking for, and throughout Ontario, because I did cater throughout Ontario. So it would be really interesting to actually talk to other business owners now about what's happening with them and how they're planning to change things or even not change things going forward. And it's also very interesting to see how many people are really paying attention to these changes and realizing that it's going to affect every single person. But I'll go into a little bit more of that detail. But now, that sound is, it's time for Fly in My Soup. This is the time of the episode where I get to vent a little bit. And I don't know if it's more of a venting, it's more of a reminder. I wanted to point out that, especially for restaurant servers, they are working at a different level of minimum wage because they serve alcohol than other minimum wage workers. Now, my concern is that when prices increase for restaurant meals, which it's going to, if you haven't already noticed or paid attention, especially franchises, their menus and their new menus for the fall have already changed. And yes, those prices have gone up. So the prices have gone up. So the staff are now basically also going to be having to be paid more, just a little bit more. But if you are making less yourself for whatever reason, I just don't want people shorting people on their tips. Because if you listen to that tipping episode, I believe it's episode 5, you can double check, I'll leave the link on it. The servers wanted to make sure that people understood that in most restaurants, servers are tipping out. And tipping out means that a portion of their tips, whether it's a flat rate, whether it's a percentage or set dollar amounts, and it is basically used to divide and also share the tips with other parts of the restaurant who are also helping to bring you that meal, meaning the cooks, the dishwasher, the bartender, the hostess. Tipping out is a pretty common practice in most restaurants. And so when you're cutting back on your tips for your server because you think they're making too much money or whatever, you don't realize that you're also hurting the other players in that restaurant who also provided you that meal and that service. So keep that in mind when you are dining out next time, especially as these price increases change because, everyone's working hard to do their job properly and to make you feel comfortable, whether it's a restaurant or it's a hotel, whether it's an airport or on a plane or bus or any kind of a tourist destination. Service industry is there to serve, and a lot of them do rely on tips. And I know these price changes are going to be a little bit of dent in your pocketbook, possibly, but just keep in mind that it's all going to basically affect everyone, and you just want to make sure you're fair.
it's difficult to have on-call staff that know all of your locations. And the thing is, you don't know what location you're going to have to backfill a shift on. If I've got people that are calling in at valet, for instance, I can't send just anybody. They have to have had an entire set of specific training, safety training modules done, and then they have to have been site-specifically trained. So I may have people that are cleaning and valet at this location, but if somebody calls in sick at this location, if they haven't got the site-specific training, I can't even send them. So oftentimes we can't backfill particular shifts because of the locations. So the thought process of having somebody kind of ready to go, it's just too onerous. They'd have to be trained on literally every building that I clean, and it's just not conceivable.
I think that training and that, for having enough skilled labor with the proper training is going to be not a requirement, but it's going to become up more of a conversation, I think, for those kind of situations in almost every industry. I mean, I even know in the restaurant and food industry, it's the same idea. As much as I can have, a long list of high school students that are willing to work because they're eager and they want extra cash, I still have to train them.
Yeah.
A lot of them maybe have never worked in the restaurant industry, or they've never served food before. They may not have their smart serve to serve alcohol. Like, there's all these different things, costs and time that's involved.
Exactly.
So filling in is not always as easy, and I think that's going to be because we're kind of leaning towards we are this service-driven economy, that the services are kind of what matter to sort of making our lives a little bit better. So I guess what we're trying to figure out now is that if this new, because it's coming up soon, and there's still so many questions out there, if there's going to be one particular issue of those list of changes that are coming between January that you can see that, okay, well, if they just maybe cut back or change this one thing, it might make it a little more tolerable as a business owner starting in January 2018. Is there one thing that you can think of, well, if they just kind of eased off on this specifically, I think it'll make a big difference?
Well, I was listening to some of the presentations at the North Bay committee meeting, and one of the I think corporate managers for the Applebee group of restaurants presented, and his request was too much too soon or too much too quickly. His recommendation was at the end of his presentation, could we not stretch this out over 3 or 4 or 5 years? You went years without having any marked increase in minimum wage, 2 or 3% over 2 or 3 years, and then a couple of quick ones over the last 2016, 2017. But one of the things that, and I'm heavily involved at our local Chamber of Commerce, and one of the things that we've been advocating for, because it always comes up as a topic of conversation, is let's have an annual increase to the minimum wage that is kind of attached to or in recognition of the CPI. And that way everybody gets a similar increase, whether it's somebody making $30 an hour who has an annual increase based on consumer price index or cost of living increase. Why not the people that are at the lower wage scale as well? And nobody ever really discussed it or could come up with a reason why. So it basically was the decision to increase or not increase was left with the government, the provincial government of the day. So here we are now, fast forward or catch up, I guess. We're looking at 22.5% between minimum wage now and Jan 1's proposal of $14 an hour, and another 7% 12 months hence. We're all end users, including the staff. They buy groceries, they buy gas, they buy clothing. So it's not going to close any wage gap. It's just going to increase right from the prices.
So their disposable income, as much as I think that's one of the I want to say the big flag that they're raising, saying it's going to increase their disposable income for the people who are making minimum wage now. But if their actual costs of living end up going up, right? Their costs of regular services, their costs of, not just like going to doctors or clinics, but their cost of everyday living, their restaurant prices, if everything's going to go up, their disposable income is probably not going to change all that much.
No, there might be kind of a sweet spot of 6 or 12 months where they, before the rest of the economy reacts to the new increases. But I know I can't wait that long. Again, 85% of my cost of doing business is labor. I will have my decision on how I'm going to approach my clients, whether it's an increase of 25% to their billing, or a reduction in service vis-a-vis a reduction in staffing hours, or a combination thereof. I'm muddling and working through that now. But the reality is, I only have so much money to spend on payroll, and my clients only have so much money to spend on janitorial service. So something's got to give.
Seems to be a common theme that this is going to affect everyone. Tracy mentioned it, I've mentioned it, and it's one of those things that when you think about it, even if you're not making minimum wage and earning more, you might be expecting a similar price increase, or even if you don't, the prices of these services and things that you buy, because there's always services attached and always require labor, those prices are going to go up, or they're going to go up in anticipation of other prices increasing, because everyone wants to get ahead of this game. So it's going to be something you're going to have to really pay attention to, and you're going to have to watch and have a little patience, because if everything does go up, it might work out, but you're going to have to sort of keep an eye on what's coming in, what's coming out, and your own cash flow issues. So before I concluded this episode, I did want to talk to one other person from a different type of business. So I reached out to Xavier Icardo. He is the general manager of Town Place Suites by Marriott here in Sudbury. And I wanted the perspective of somebody from the hotel industry, because they do have another different levels of employees and wages that they are going to have to maneuver. And I was interested to see on what he was basing his plans for this coming season, and if there's going to be any changes for Town Place Suites or for the hotel industry in general. So I guess one of my first questions has to do with how much you think the minimum wage increase on its own, without all the other changes, is going to really affect your scheduling, staffing, or just general expenses here at the hotel with respect to the actual end pricing that the consumer is going to see.
Okay, so that's a few questions.
Okay, sorry.
But no, that's fine. So I'll start by the scheduling. I don't think that in our environment we're going to be cutting corners to try to save money, because we have a quality product that we're very proud of, and we got to stick to those standards. Our customers are expecting a certain level of quality. So at the end of the day, we're not going to use less people because it costs more. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make business sense at all. So that's answer number one.
Okay.
On that question. The answer number two is that very clearly, yes, there's going to be an increase of costs. It's very clear. Big corporations, will mumble because it's going to cut into their profit margins, but big corporations really won't care. They'll still pay, and it won't make a huge difference. I think the smaller businesses are going to be a little more affected, I think, because ultimately there's going to be an increase of costs, so you've got to pass it on to somebody else. And I think that's your third part of the question, where we can imagine that payroll being one of the biggest chunk of money in any profit and loss statement or budget, that you're going to have to definitely try to increase some rates somewhere. So a big company like Walmart or whatever, you know what, it's going to be lost in the mass, and it won't really make a big difference, even though there will be still some consequences. In our case, we have a certain amount of rooms here, and you would argue that somehow we're going to have, just like we would do with a renovation, a new project, a new building, or new carpeting, etc. You'll have to unfortunately pass it on. So I don't know if it will happen in this particular case. It will depend on what our owners are going to say. But I'm assuming that businesses of the size of this one would certainly have to unfortunately do something about it. I see restaurants, for example, printing new menus.
Yes, already I've been hearing they're in print right now.
So they're already increasing their rates with new menus, and simply because they're getting ready. So the idea is not to make more money. The idea is to cover our costs to a certain extent. And to simply remain profitable at the same level. And that, I think, is where there might be in smaller businesses some sort of challenge to try to figure out, so do you pass it on to your customers or not? One thing, and I don't have the answer to that question, one thing I can tell you is that we will not jeopardize quality by saying, hey, we're going to hire 1.2 people because it's as expensive as 2 before. That's not gonna happen. We got I think most companies that are proud of their product and their services will maintain that level of quality, and that's not negotiable. So are we going to be more creative in some instances? Are we going to be more careful, more cautious? Are we going to control more? You bet.
Yes.
And that's what I was saying about competition in general, is that this is another very competitive approach, is you're going to realize, okay, yeah, maybe we need to start watching energy consumption more. Maybe we need to start watching some of the suppliers more. Are we getting double dipped on some items that we're buying? I think it's going to force a lot of companies that are, I think, smart in the way they run their business to pay more attention to their business. So in that particular perspective, I think it's pretty cool, because it's going to force us to say, yeah, okay, this is going to cost us more, therefore we need to save more somewhere else. Is it going to be the way we operate, or passed on to the customer at the end of the chain? I'm not sure. Everybody will look at it differently. I think there's a great opportunity to first look at your own organization and figure out how you can do things.
So I think the overall message for business owners is that they're going to have to learn to look at every single line item in their income and expenses and try to figure out where other changes can be made so it doesn't affect the quality of the product or service that they're trying to provide. It's going to be an interesting game of flexing those things here and there until they can find the right balance, and every business is going to have to make its own decision. So if you listen to part 1 and now part 2 of this topic, you're going to have a better idea of some of the decisions that business owners are trying to grapple with and how it can affect their employees and you as customers. So hopefully that gave you a bit of an overview. If you did miss the first part of this episode, I am going to provide the link in the show notes. And as always, the show notes can be found at stephaniepichet.ca/flavor9. And flavor is, of course, spelled the Canadian way, FLAVOUR 9. I'm going to give you the link for the previous part 1 episode that also has all kinds of links in it if you want to look more into the different changes that are coming and different perspectives. So there's the link to Chamber of Commerce and their website and papers that they're putting out here in Ontario. There's the link to the Ministry of Labour, so you can see their side of the discussion. There's a couple of other links in there that I think might be interesting for you. And if you want to join in on any group discussions throughout Ontario, I'm sure if you talk to your local Chamber of Commerce office, they'd be happy to let you know if there's any information sessions or other meetings that are coming up that you'll be able to participate in and maybe put in your 2 cents. Okay, so now we are going to be concluding the episode, but before we do, I want to end it on a little lighter note. since we're talking about such serious things today. And of course, we're going to do table topics. So table topics are those fun little cards that you can get to do conversation starting for any little get together, whether it's a business corporate event, or you can even use it just for dinner parties. And I have just about one of every table topics box because I use these quite a bit. And I'm going to pull one from the road trip box today, and it seemed fitting. The question of the day is, would you rather live in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or San Francisco? Now, interestingly enough, of course, table topics are created in the States, so they were only listing American cities. But if I had to choose one of the four, I would choose New York. Partly because I just love the city, and second of all, it is close to my hometown. So even if I had to move to the States for work or anything else, I would choose to live in New York so I could have a quicker access to Canada, and I could still get my big city feeling with the northern weather that I'm used to. I just got to get used to that snow. Sheesh. Okay. Thanks for listening. A couple of other thank yous, of course. Thank you to Tracy Nutt, Service Master, and Build North here in Sudbury. I believe that as this is launching, she is in India touring around. So I can't wait to chat with her when she gets back and find out how she enjoyed her trip. And thank you, of course, to Xavier Ricardo from Town Place Suites in Sudbury. I do love that hotel. I used to cater in that hotel for my clients quite a bit, and their staff has always been amazing. So I know how much quality of service actually means to them. So thank you again to Xavier and the entire team at Town Place Suites. And thanks to you, of course, for listening. This is episode 9. We are past that benchmark where people always say that people lose interest in creating podcasts. So I obviously haven't lost any interest, so I guess you're stuck with me. So make sure you tune in next Saturday for episode 10 and beyond. Subscribe to Flying for Flavor on iTunes. If you can, please leave us a rating and review. And of course, you can follow me on all social media channels. So in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll chat with you next week.